Well, it's great to be with all of you here at End Times with Pastor Eric. Now, I was going to be doing, dear ones, part 2 on how Marxism seeks to destroy Israel. I found out from my congregation, not so helpful. Stay in your lane, they say to Eric, and I'm going to do so. So we're going to get back to pure eschatology, the kind that will make you proud, the kind that will make you want to break out your Clarence Larkin chart and start marking it up. So today we're going to get back to the timing of the rapture. Recall a few messages ago, I talked about the timing of the rapture, and I started to address the post-tribulational rapture, and I found it to be unbiblical. Now, again, I want to remind everyone out there, if you're premillennial, you believe in the literal return of Jesus Christ bodily to raise up his people, to set up a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on the earth, founded in Jerusalem, then you're okay in my book. You get a double thumbs up. Saying that, we can divide over the timing of the rapture, meaning we can differ on it. We don't have to divide as brothers and sisters, is what I mean by that. So if you have some other view on the rapture, you're okay in my book. Now today, I have a lot of friends who are in the Prewrath Rapture. They are great scholars, great biblical students in their own right, but I'll be showing you why I don't think it's biblical, why I never bought into it, and some of the evidence against it. And again, this will be just part 1. Okay, so with that, let's begin. I want to talk about some central claims that Prewrath makes. And I want to begin by talking about how the Prewrath Rapture position maintains that the rapture occurs after the 6th seal, sometime during the last half of Daniel's 70th week. Now, let me pull up my pointer and explain my diagram if you don't understand it. On this timeline, I'm showing the cross to represent the first coming of Christ. Just generically, his perfect life, his death, burial, resurrection, ascension, and the sending of the Spirit is all symbolized by the cross. That ushered in the last days. Okay, so we are living in the last days, or the church age, you might want to call it, or the time of the Gentiles. That will last until the 70th week of Daniel, the last 7 years. Obviously, my timeline is not to scale. So in this last 7 years, known as Daniel's 70th week, the midpoint is at the 3.5-year mark. What the pre-wrath position maintains is that sometime during this last 3.5 years, there's going to be a rapture of the church that will occur after the 6th seal. Okay, now recall in the book of Revelation, from chapter 6 all the way to chapter 19, you're dealing, I believe, with the last 7 years or Daniel's 70th week. So remember, the structure of Revelation is from chapter 6 to 19, you have the unveiling of 7 seals, and the 7th seal opens up to the 7 trumpets. The 7 trumpet judgments, okay, come upon the earth. The 7th trumpet opens up to the 7 bowls. And finally, when you get to the 7th bowl, it's completed. You've gone from the beginning to the end of the 70th week of Daniel. So in the pre-wrath position, sometime after the 6th seal, just prior to the 7th seal, therefore the 7 trumpets being opened, which would be sometime in those last 3.5 years, you're going to have the rapture. That's what they believe. And so they believe that imminence is defined by you not knowing exactly when within this 3.5 years Christ will return. So they claim you will know the general time period in which Christ will return to rapture the church, but you won't know specifically the day and the hour. That's how they would handle the idea of imminence. What they call it is expectancy, not imminence. Okay? Premise number 2. The pre-wrath position claims this final 3.5 years, also known as the Great Tribulation, will be cut short by the rapture. So the idea then is that you and I as believers will somehow be brought out by the rapture prior to this coming wrath, which will occur only sometime in the last 3.5 years. Okay, so this is where we would somewhat differ, again, with the pre-wrath position if you're pre-trib. Okay, now what I'm going to do is take issue with this premise today. We'll do other contentions later in other messages, but let me come to premise 3. The pre-wrath position claims that God's wrath is only found after the 6th seal, and therefore the previous seal judgments are merely the wrath of man and Satan. What I would say to that as a premillennialist is no, the wrath is clearly found, I believe, in the first seals. And the very opening seal judgments, you have peace taken from the earth. Well, we know that the day of the Lord comes while they're saying peace and safety. So if peace is taken from the earth, it's a good bet that at the first seal, the beginning of the 70th week, you have wrath. That's my opinion. But what I want to do is focus on the second premise, and that is the pre-wrath claims that the final 3.5 years, the Great Tribulation, is cut short by the rapture. So what they're claiming is this last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week, known as the Great Tribulation, is not going to really be 3.5 years. And this is absolutely essential to their view. The pre-wrath proponent would say that that 3.5 year period, again, total is 7 years, but we're focusing on the last 3.5 years, is not going to last that long. It's going to be less than that. What I'm going to show you is I believe that to be unbiblical. I believe that to be a major problem. Okay? And I'll show you why. All right? So let's ask ourselves the question, is it true, as the pre-wrath proponents claim, that Daniel's 70th week will be cut short? If we can prove that no, in fact, Daniel's 70th week is in its entirety is 7 years, and in fact the last 3.5 years is 3.5 years, it's not going to be less than that, then the pre-wrath position is done. Okay, it is absolutely essential to their view. Okay, so let's examine it. I want to show you a passage where they glean this idea that indeed the 70th week will be cut short, again specifically the last 3.5 years. They derive this from the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24:21 through 22. This is where Jesus says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." Now, here's where we agree as pre-tribulational proponents with the pre-wrathers. We do believe that indeed the Great Tribulation is the last 3.5 years. That's the focus that Jesus is focusing on here. We also believe that this is referring not to what you see during the church age. That would be an error. Now, how do we know that? Well, because Matthew 24:15, just 6 verses earlier, Jesus said, "So when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Well, that placed us squarely in the midst of the 70th week of Daniel. What's more, notice here, Jesus is describing tribulation that has never occurred nor ever will. This is the worst time period ever. So the worst time period ever can't be in the church age, but it has to be relegated, of course, to the 70th week of Daniel. Okay? Now, specifically, when it talks about the Great Tribulation, we're focused on the last 3.5 years. And what the pre-wrath position says is because those days would be cut short, as Jesus says, they say, aha, that means that the 3.5 years will in fact not be 3.5 years. It'll be sometime less than that. How much shorter? You don't know. That's their idea of expectancy. Again, they poo-poo the doctrine of imminence. They claim you'll have the general knowledge of when Jesus will come, but you won't know the specific day and hour that will be in the last 3.5 years. Okay? So I think there's really two options then, if you boil down Jesus' words where he says that those days would be cut short. And again, that's for the sake of the elect. The idea is if those days had not been cut short, then no flesh would have survived. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Well, there's two options when we interpret that phrase, those days will be cut short. Option one is that Jesus means God's original plan was to ensure the Great Tribulation would last no longer than 3.5 years. That's my view. Most pre-tribulationalists, I don't know of anyone who would hold to a different view than this, and I think almost every post-tribulationalist and mid-tribulationalist would believe that those days being cut short means that it would only go 3.5 total years for the Great Tribulation, or a full 7 years for the entirety of the 70th week of Daniel. I hope you're picking up what I'm laying down here. Okay? Does that make sense? So what I'm assuming is that when Jesus says it's going to be cut short, I'm assuming that it's 3.5 years. It's not less than that. Well, that is not the assumption of the pre-wrath proponent. The pre-wrath proponent thinks that Jesus means that God will cut the 3.5 year periods short so that it is shorter than the 3.5 years. It's going to be less than that. Is everyone with me? Now, if I can prove to you that in fact the 3.5 year mark or 3.5 year period, the Great Tribulation, is going to be 3.5 years, or in fact the 70th week of Daniel in its entirety is 7 years, well, then that disproves the pre-wrath position, because that would show that the wrath is not cut short by a rapture sometime in the last 3.5 years. Okay, so that's what we want to do. We want to wrestle with which one of these two options is biblical. Did Jesus mean that those days would be cut short to 3.5 years, or to be less than that? That's what we're going to be wrestling with. Well, I believe the Bible clearly teaches that the Great Tribulation period will last 3.5 years. What I want to do is show you some biblical evidence for that. So let's begin with Revelation 13:5. Now, Revelation is important because it's written after the book of Matthew was written. Okay, the book of Revelation was written, I believe, in the reign of Domitian around 95 AD. I think that's clearly what the evidence suggests. So it's more than likely probably at least 30 years after the writing of Matthew. Now, why is that important in Revelation 13:5? Well, because here we have the description of the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness. Notice what John writes as he's inspired by the Spirit. He says, there was given to him, that's to the Antichrist, a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. Okay, so notice how long is the Antichrist, or the beast, going to be reigning? Well, for 42 months. Now, how do we know that he's going to be reigning for 42 months, which is 3.5 years? That coincides with the last 3.5 years here. Well, the reason we know that is because of the term authority. The term authority there, exousia, means that yes, indeed, God has granted this beast to exercise this authority for this 3.5 year period. Okay, now here's the point. If in fact Jesus meant that this period would be less than that, remember he says that those days be cut short. If he had intended to say that yes, it's going to be less than 3.5 years, why is John 30 some years later at least revealing that this time period is indeed 3.5 years, or 42 months? Remember, the Jews used 30-day calendars. They used a lunar calendar. Okay, well, obviously I think Revelation 13:5 shows us that the answer to the question that we saw in the previous slide is that Jesus meant that the 3.5 years would be cut short to be no more than the last 3.5 years. In other words, it wouldn't go any longer than that. Why? Because he's revealing to us by the authority of the Holy Spirit that in fact the beast, the man of lawlessness, is going to be reigning for 3.5 years. Okay, so if you're a pre-wrath proponent, you have to modify this. Where if you're pre-trib or post-trib or mid-trib, you just read this and say, yep, the Antichrist is going to reign for this last 3.5 years. Okay, by the way, if in fact John knew that this time period was going to be cut short, why doesn't he simply modify this as Jesus does, like in Matthew 24:15. Remember in Matthew 24:15, Jesus says, so when you see the abomination that causes desolation, then he puts parenthetically, let the reader understand. So the idea is it's calling us as the careful reader to have wisdom to understand what the scriptures are saying and where that reference is to, namely Daniel 9:27. In the same way, if John wanted us to realize that this 42 months is actually going to be less than that, why didn't he put a parenthetical in there, of course it will be cut short? But he never reveals that. He simply reveals that the Antichrist is going to have authority to rule and to reign for 42 months, namely the last 3.5 years. So to me, right there, it shows us that indeed the biblical evidence is clear that when Jesus says, unless those days be cut short, no flesh would survive, he meant that they would be cut short total to 7 years, and specifically the last 3.5 years would only be 3.5 years. That's what he meant by it. Now, let me give you some more corroboration to this view. Remember, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul is referring to the same beast or man of lawlessness that receives authority in Revelation 13:5, who reigns for 42 months. Remember in 2 Thessalonians 2:8, Paul says this regarding this beast, this man of lawlessness. He says, then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. By the way, the term coming there is the term parousia. The term parousia, if you've seen previous messages where I've talked about this, the parousia, I believe, refers to the entirety of the 70th week. So whether you talk about the beginning, any part in the middle, or the end, it's all part of the parousia. So what Paul is revealing in 2 Thessalonians 2:8 is that at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, this Antichrist is going to be brought to an end, katargeo. He's going to be done away with. That's what he's saying. Now, why do I think that that's important? Well, what it shows us is that Jesus' return at the end of the 70th week is what in fact destroys him. In fact, you can read about that in Revelation 19:20. In fact, I'll read that in just a moment. Okay, now how would a pre-wrath proponent respond to this? Well, what they will say is the phrase bring to an end comes from katargeo, and they would claim that that means that it's a process, that it doesn't happen all at once, but the power of the Antichrist is somewhat muted and it kind of dies out. That's what they would claim, and so that would give them this shortened version by Christ's return, and yet the Antichrist isn't completely destroyed. What I would say to that is I think that's reading too much into the verb. Normally, the verb katargeo simply means to make something to cease. Let me give you some examples. Let's look at Ephesians 2:15. I'm going to read from my notes here. This is how Paul uses katargeo. Ephesians 2:15, he says, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two, that would be Jew and Gentile, into one new man, establishing peace. Notice the phrase abolishing. The idea in Ephesians 2:15 is Jesus Christ abolished, that is, he got rid of the warfare between Jew and Gentile as he fulfilled the law of Moses. Okay, that's the idea. So in the fulfillment of the law of Moses in Christ, he abolishes the warfare between Jew and Gentile, making the one new man. So the idea of abolish or get rid of is certainly in keeping with what Christ is going to do here. The emphasis here in katargeo is that he is bringing to an end this authority that he had to act for the 3.5 years, and he's going to obviously do that at the end of the 3.5 year mark. Okay, that's the idea. All right, now let me give you another passage. Let me read to you Revelation 19:20, how this is going to occur. I'm going to scroll down in my notes here and try to read this to you. Notice here, Revelation 19:20, it's talking about the beast, this very one who has the authority, the one who's going to be brought to an end by the appearance of Christ coming. Revelation 19:20, now this, remember, is occurring at the end of the 70th week. Revelation 19:20, it says, and the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire which burns with brimstone. So notice here, at the very end of the 70th week of Daniel, when you have this final battle, you're going to have the Messiah utterly destroy the Antichrist and the false prophet by throwing them where? Into the lake of fire. Okay, so I'm pointing this out to show you that this is not a reference to the rapture sometime in the midst of the 3.5 years, the final 3.5, but rather it is a destruction of the Antichrist at the end of the 3.5 year period, where in fact Jesus is going to set up his millennial kingdom. So that explains then why the Antichrist is given authority to rule or to act for 42 months or the last 3.5 years. It's not going to be less than that. So when the Messiah returns at that final battle as the enemies surround Jerusalem, that's when Christ is going to destroy the beast and the armies associated with him. That's the idea. Okay, so again, I'm showing you that there's no evidence that this reign of the beast is going to be less than 3.5 years. He's going to be taken out by Jesus Christ at the end of that 3.5 year mark, or the total 7 year 70th week of Daniel. Okay, all right, so let me give you some more corroborating verses here. Let me put some more up. Let's look at Daniel 7:25. Let's go back to the Old Testament, and let's recall in Daniel 7, you have this prophecy in which Daniel is revealing the work of the Son of Man, the one who has all authority, who's going to rule and reign upon the earth. Well, notice here in Daniel 7:25, he's talking, that is Daniel, about the Antichrist. Notice he describes him as one he will speak, he says, out against the Most High, and wear down the saints of the highest one, and he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for time, times, and half a time. Now, what in the world is time, times, and half a time? Well, time there, idon, in the Hebrew, means just that. It means time. But then when you get to times, you have idonin. The "in" ending means it's plural. It's two. So notice 1 and 2, you have 3. And then you have the term pulag for half, idin. Or, I'm sorry, idon. Okay, so you have 3.5 years. That's what you have. So the time, times, and half a time is certainly from the Hebrew. I think there's no way around it to say that's 3.5 years. Okay, so how long does the Antichrist reign according to Daniel 7:25? Well, 3.5 years. Now, if you're pre-wrath, you have to say, well, that doesn't really mean that, because it has to be modified by Matthew chapter 24, verses 21 through 22. And again, you might say, well, there's merit in that. After all, Eric, the New Testament comes after Daniel, and certainly it can be modified through progressive revelation. You may make that argument. The problem is in Revelation 13:5, which is dated after Matthew, you have again it revealed by the Spirit through John the Apostle that the Antichrist reigns for 3.5 years, 42 months, as I just showed you in the previous slide. Okay, now let's show you another one here. This is Daniel 9:27. Again, this is referring to the Antichrist. Notice it says he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. Let me just stop there for a moment. Some preterists make the claim that the he here who makes a firm covenant is in fact Christ, not Antichrist. That would be false. Let me ask you, when did Jesus Christ make a covenant for 7 years? 1 week of years. And then at the middle of it, put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering. Well, it makes no sense. He never did that. Okay, Jesus' covenant is an eternal covenant. Okay, this is a covenant made for 1 week that is 1/7 of years. How do we know that Daniel's dealing with years? Because he's building off of the 70 years that Israel would be in captivity that was revealed by Jeremiah the prophet. That's how we know that. So we know that Daniel's dealing with a week of years or 7 years. So literally what this is saying is the Antichrist will make a covenant with the many, which is Israel, for 7 years. But notice it says in the middle of the week, this is at the midpoint, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. What's being described here is the abomination of desolation, in which the Antichrist sets himself up in the temple and declares himself to be God. That's exactly what Paul refers to in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 4 through 8. Okay, why is that important? Because I'm showing you that Daniel's again revealing the 70th week to be just that, a 7-year period. And in the middle of it, the 3.5 year mark, the Antichrist creates this abomination of desolation. So again, how long is the last 7 years? Well, it's 7 years. How long is the last 3.5 years? Well, it's 3.5 years. Okay, and again, the book of Revelation does not modify that. It assumes that. That's what I'm claiming. Okay, so over and over and over in the Bible, we see that the last 3.5 years is going to be just that. It's not going to be less than that. It's going to be 3.5 years. Okay, let me show you another one. This is Daniel 12:7. Remember, the resurrection is associated with the 70th week of Daniel. It doesn't get into specifics, but later in Daniel 12:7, notice Daniel reveals, he says, I heard the man dressed in linen who was above the waters of the river as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven and swore by him, so he's swearing by God who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. Well, that's 3.5 years. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be accomplished. Well, who's the they and who are the holy people that are being shattered? Well, the they are the Gentiles. The Gentiles under the rule and reign of the Antichrist. Well, how long are they going to shatter the people? What's going to be for a year, 2 years, so that's 3 total, and half year, that's 3.5 years, just as we saw in Daniel 7:25. So for 3.5 years, you're going to have a shattering of the holy people, namely the people of Israel. Now, when does that happen? Well, that's the last 3.5 years known as the Great Tribulation. That's why Jesus says that upon the world will come such tribulation such as never occurred nor ever will. Okay, but again, notice it's assumed by Daniel that's going to be 3.5 years. It's not going to be less than that. It's revealed to be that. Okay, that's what I'm claiming. So again, we get to the book of Revelation, Revelation 11:2. Here, John reveals the court is to be not the court, by the way, here that's being referred to is ole, which simply means the outer court. The temple, which is naos, that would be the inner sanctuary. Okay, so let me just, before I read this to you, the temple that's being referred to here would be the inner sanctuary where you have the Holy of Holies and the holy place. You have the court of the Israelites and the women. Okay, but on the outside, the ole is the wider court. So if you add the court, which is ole, and the temple, naos, you get something called the Hieron, the entire complex. Okay, now why am I laboring this? Because in Revelation 11:1, God has, John here, he has this measurement of the temple. Why is that important? Because when God measures something, it shows that he owns it. For example, when you get to Ezekiel chapter 40, verse 3, you have this new temple that's going to be the millennial temple, and God has it measured. Why? Because his favor is upon it, or it belongs to him. In fact, in 2 Samuel 8:2, remember there David had defeated the Moabites in battle. Remember he had them lay down and he had them measured? Why did he measure them? Why would David measure Moabites that he defeated in battle, according to 2 Samuel 8:2? Because he owned them. That's the idea. And so in Revelation 11:1, God has the temple measured because he owns it. It's showing that his favor is returning, even despite the fact that the Antichrist is doing what he's doing and the Gentiles are doing what they're doing. His favor has returned. But what's left out of the measurement is the court which is outside the temple. He says, do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations. These are the Gentiles that belong to the rule of Antichrist. Notice he says, and they will tread underfoot the holy city, that's Jerusalem, for 42 months. Well, how long is 42 months? It's the same as the 3.5 years here, marked by Daniel 12:27. These two events are describing, these two passages, I want to say verses, passages, and events all at once. Sorry, these two verses are describing the same event, which is the people of Israel being downtrodden by the Gentiles in the reign of Antichrist in this last 3.5 year period. That's what's being described. So again, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, why doesn't John reveal that the 42 months is actually going to be less than that? Because after all, Jesus says it's going to be cut short. No, he never modifies that. He simply reveals that it's going to be 42 months. Now, why is this important? Well, because I think it shows us that indeed the last 3.5 years is going to be just that. It's not going to be cut short less than that. Again, Revelation 12:6, this is about the provision that God has for Israel as she's brought out into the wilderness. Notice here, Revelation 12:6, it says, then the woman, that's Israel, fled into the wilderness. Now, let's stop there for just a moment. Remember, the first time the Israelites were in the wilderness, that was at the Exodus, they didn't believe. They fell in the wilderness. Remember, they were in the wilderness for 40 years. What happened? They fell because of unbelief. Okay? Fast forward. The prophet Hosea predicted a day in which God would meet his people Israel in the wilderness, and then they would actually believe in him. So they would get a do-over in the wilderness. You can read about that in the book of Hosea, that he would speak to his people and they would become his people and he would be their God. Well, fast forward to John the Baptist. Where does John the Baptist meet the people of Israel? He meets them in the wilderness. And it's as if this is going to be their do-over. But what happens? The vast majority of the Israelites reject the Messiah. Jesus goes where before his temptation? Well, he goes into the wilderness. Okay, so why does Jesus go into the wilderness for 40 days and he succeeds where Israel failed? Because he's the faithful son that Israel never was. Why am I laboring that? Because one day in the future, God, remember in Hosea, promised that he's going to meet Israel in the wilderness, and this time they're going to get it right. This time, by his power, they're going to believe and obey. Well, that's what's happening here. He's going to lead Israel out into the wilderness, and this is where they're going to come to faith in him. This is going to be the establishment of Israel. Notice it says, where she, this is the woman, had a place prepared by God, so there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. How long is 1,260 days? Well, that's the same as 42 months. It's the same as time times and half a time. It's the same as 3.5 years. Well, again, over and over and over, the scriptures reveal that this time period in which Israel is being hounded and persecuted by Antichrist, that time period is a full 3.5 years. Now, why is this important? Well, my assumption is that based on the biblical data that God intended the 70th week of Daniel to be a full 7 years from beginning to end, and that in fact the last 3.5 years would be just that. So when Jesus says this, Matthew 24:21-22, he says, "For then there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days be cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." I'm assuming it was cut short to 3.5 years for the last Great Tribulation, or again 7 for its entirety. Why? Because that's what the biblical data suggests. John doesn't modify it later in the book of Revelation. Now, what this means then, in my humble opinion, is I think this makes the pre-wrath position untenable. What they have built is the whole system is built on this foundation where this last 3.5 years has to be cut short. It has to be less than 3.5 years. If that is not true, the whole pre-wrath position crumbles. And dear brothers and sisters, again, you're going to have to weigh the evidence for yourself. But for me, what I've done in my own life is I've looked at that. And by the way, I looked at this about 15 years ago. And I had some dear friends I think are brilliant who hold to this. And I'm just explaining why I, Eric Dalma, with a good conscience, couldn't hold to it. Okay, so if you find it compelling that it's going to be less than that last 3.5 years, well, then you've got to do you. Okay, and again, if you're premillennial, you believe in the literal bodily return of Jesus Christ, who's going to raise the dead and reign from Jerusalem and rule for 1,000 years and bring in the eternal states. If you believe that, you're okay in my book. What I'm just saying is I don't buy it. I don't think that the time period is less than 3.5 years. I think the idea of it being cut short was 3.5 years. In other words, that was the original intent, that God would not allow the 70th week of Daniel to go any longer than 7 total years, and the Great Tribulation he would not allow to go any longer than 3.5 years. Had he allowed it to go longer, no one would survive. One more thing I want to throw out there. In light of this very fact that no one would survive this time period if it was not limited to 7 years or 3.5 for the Great Tribulation, it shows us that this cannot happen in 70 AD as the preterists claim. Okay, remember, the big problem that I see in theology or eschatology today is preterism. I am not a fan. Many of you know that by now if you've watched all of my videos. How can you have the worst time period ever in the year 70 AD? Was that the worst time period ever? Because after all, the book of Revelation describes a time period in which 1/3 of the waters turned to blood. Well, did that happen in 70 AD? No. Did a 1/3 of the ships are going to be destroyed, according to the book of Revelation? That sounds like the worst time period ever. Did that happen in 70 AD? No. How about 1/3 of humanity dying due to a demonic horde, according to Revelation chapter 9? That never happened in 70 AD. But yet these things are going to come upon the world, and that's why Jesus says that this tribulation is such that has never occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Dear ones, this is going to be the worst time period ever. And again, what I think is clearly revealed in Scripture is God had promised to limit it to a full 7 years, and in particular the last 3.5 years, to just that. It's not going to be less than 3.5. It's going to be limited to 3.5 years. And on that basis, I think pre-wrath is wrong and therefore should be jettisoned. Well, we'll come back next time and look at some more evidence regarding the pre-wrath view. We'll wrestle with when does wrath truly begin, and we'll start wrestling with some of the contentions that wrath is not present in the opening seal judgment. So we'll catch you next time with End Times with Pastor Eric.